January 10, 1943. German High Command Headquarters, Berlin. The room was dim, heavy curtains drawn against the winter light. Maps of North Africa lay spread across the table, corners curled, edges pinned by ashtrays and dispatch folders. Present were liaison officers from the Africa Corps and senior staff officers assigned to relay operational assessments directly to Berlin. At the center sat Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, rigid, unsmiling, his attention fixed on intelligence summaries delivered from Tunisia. Rommel did not speak of British maneuvers. He did not dwell on American supply capacity or air power. He bypassed the conventional threat analysis entirely. His message was narrow, deliberate, and atypical for a German field commander accustomed to cataloging enemy weaknesses. He identified a single American officer by name, George S. Patton. Rommel reported that Patton's recent assumption of command had already altered the behavior of American formations previously dismissed as ineffective. Units that had collapsed under pressure weeks earlier at Kasserine Pass were no longer behaving as expected. Discipline had been imposed rapidly. Command relationships had been clarified. Movement had become coordinated. Counterattacks were no longer tentative or delayed. They were immediate and probing. Rommel emphasized that this change could not be attributed to reinforcements or equipment. The Americans had possessed material abundance before. What they had lacked was coherence. Patton, in Rommel's assessment, had supplied that missing element with speed. The warning Rommel delivered was not tactical. He did not request specific maneuvers or battlefield adjustments. He issued a strategic reassessment. American forces under Patton's command, he stated, could no longer be categorized as inexperienced or predictable. Their methods now reflected principles long practiced by German armored commanders: rapid decision cycles, aggressive forward pressure, and exploitation of hesitation before it could solidify into defense. Rommel stressed that the danger lay not in Patton's numbers, but in his mindset. A commander who understood operational tempo, who enforced initiative down the chain of command, could convert previously brittle units into a force capable of upsetting the balance in North Africa. The recommendation was explicit. Berlin was advised to revise its assumptions, reinforce vulnerable sectors where possible, and prepare contingencies for an opponent capable of thinking and acting faster than German planning cycles allowed. This assessment was filed, circulated, and retained. It was not speculative. It was a professional judgment delivered without ornament. In that room, Rommel formally recorded an acknowledgment rare in German intelligence traffic of the period. Among Allied commanders in theater, Patton constituted a systemic threat requiring immediate recognition. In early 1943, the operational environment in Tunisia presented a narrow but concrete opportunity. It was defined not by grand strategy or distant reinforcements, but by the immediate geometry of terrain, force posture, and time. American formations had just been bloodied. At Kasserine Pass, their deficiencies were exposed with brutal clarity. Command was fragmented. Units lacked coordination. Retreats had become contagious. From a German perspective, this should have marked the Americans as a secondary concern, a force to be contained while attention remained focused elsewhere. But the battlefield itself told a more complex story. Tunisia compressed movement. Mountain passes funneled armor. Coastal roads limited lateral maneuver. The interior, however, remained open enough for mobile forces willing to accept risk. German units, though experienced, were dispersed across defensive points designed to delay, not to absorb sustained pressure. Their supply lines stretched eastward under constant strain, vulnerable to disruption if forced into reactive redeployment. American forces, despite their inexperience, possessed material sufficiency. Tanks, artillery, transport, and fuel were available in quantity. What they lacked was not capacity, but synchronization. The pieces existed. The system to employ them did not. That gap created the opportunity. German intelligence recognized that Axis reserves in North Africa were finite. Armored units were committed in fragments. Infantry formations were overextended, holding ground out of necessity rather than advantage. This meant that any opponent capable of creating local superiority, even briefly, could force withdrawals disproportionate to the pressure applied. The terrain amplified this risk. A breakthrough at a pass did not merely dislodge a position. It threatened the coherence of the entire defensive scheme. Roads mattered more than ground. Once movement was compelled, control degraded rapidly. Under these conditions, a commander willing to prioritize tempo over caution could exploit German dispersion. Rapid probing attacks could identify weak seams. Concentrated thrusts could force German units to reposition faster than their logistics allowed. Even without overwhelming numbers, speed could substitute for mass. This was not theoretical. It was measurable. American divisions were motorized. They could move faster than German infantry formations anchored to fixed defenses. Their artillery, when coordinated, could suppress counterattacks long enough to enable maneuver. Air support, though still uneven, increasingly favored the Allies, further complicating German attempts to regroup under pressure. The critical factor was decision-making speed. German doctrine assumed that American command structures would delay exploitation. Orders would be centralized. Opportunities would be debated. By the time action was authorized, German units could recover or withdraw in good order. That assumption had governed German planning up to Kasserine. But the environment no longer supported that expectation. If American forces acted with initiative, if subordinate commanders were permitted to exploit local success without awaiting approval, the balance could shift quickly. German units, forced to respond simultaneously across multiple points, would be unable to concentrate armor effectively. Their operational flexibility, once an advantage, would become a liability under sustained pressure. The opportunity, therefore, was not a single attack or offensive. It was the chance to impose a different rhythm on the campaign. A high-tempo American corps, properly coordinated, could force German commanders into continuous reaction. Each response would consume fuel, expose supply routes, and degrade cohesion. The result would not be immediate collapse, but cumulative erosion of control. From a purely military perspective, the logic was straightforward. Tunisia rewarded initiative. It punished rigidity. The side that dictated tempo would shape outcomes disproportionate to its numerical strength. That opportunity existed only briefly. It depended on speed, audacity, and the willingness to accept operational risk before the enemy could adapt. For the first time in the North African campaign, the battlefield favored not experience alone, but the capacity to act faster than established doctrine allowed. It was this opening, created by terrain, dispersion, and material sufficiency, that transformed American potential into something more dangerous. The conditions were present. The question was no longer whether exploitation was possible, but whether it would be permitted. By February 1943, the change Rommel observed was no longer abstract. It was procedural, behavioral, and visible across the American front. When George S. Patton assumed command of two corps, the transformation began at the level German commanders understood best: command enforcement. Rommel's intelligence reports did not dwell on speeches or symbolism. They recorded alterations in pattern. Units that had previously delayed movement now advanced on schedule. Orders were executed without negotiation. Lapses were corrected immediately, often publicly. Officers unable to maintain control were replaced without ceremony. Rommel recognized this as preparatory behavior. Before maneuver warfare could function, discipline had to be restored. Patton did not innovate tactically at first. He stabilized. He imposed order on a system that had failed under stress. German observers noted that American patrol activity increased sharply, not in scale, but in regularity. Reconnaissance became persistent. Positions were tested repeatedly. There was no pause to recover psychologically from Kasserine. Rommel understood the significance. This was not recovery. It was recalibration. Patton decentralized authority with intent. Subordinate commanders were permitted, expected, to exploit opportunity without awaiting layered approval. This alone marked a departure from prior American conduct. German doctrine relied on the enemy's hesitation. Patton removed that hesitation. Rommel had built his own reputation on similar principles. He recognized the pattern because he had used it himself. Rommel's reports emphasized tempo. American movements became faster not because equipment had changed, but because decisions were made earlier in the cycle. Logistics, long a weakness, were reorganized to support forward motion rather than static defense. German intelligence intercepted communications indicating improved coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery, still imperfect, but functional under pressure. Patton's presence at the front was noted repeatedly. He appeared in forward areas, inspected units personally, and enforced standards face-to-face. To Rommel, this mattered. Command presence accelerated behavioral change. It compressed adaptation timelines. German assessments concluded that American learning curves under Patton were steeper than anticipated. Crucially, Rommel did not interpret these developments as isolated to one corps. He saw them as transferable. Once the method proved effective, it could be replicated elsewhere. That made Patton dangerous not merely as a battlefield commander, but as a catalyst for institutional change. Rommel prepared accordingly. His warnings to Berlin shifted tone. Earlier reports had described American forces as improving. Now they were described as converging toward German operational norms. Rommel emphasized that Patton's understanding of maneuver warfare was not theoretical. It was applied under combat conditions, adapted in real time, and enforced without compromise. Rommel also noted what Patton did not do. He did not wait for overwhelming superiority. He did not consolidate excessively before acting. He accepted friction as a constant rather than a disqualifier. These were German assumptions turned against their originators. The warning sharpened. Rommel stated explicitly that continued exposure to Patton's leadership would erase American deficiencies faster than German planning cycles could adjust. Each engagement would not merely test American units, it would educate them. This assessment carried weight because it was grounded in evidence, not admiration. Rommel did not praise outcomes. He cataloged inputs. Discipline enforced. Authority delegated. Tempo increased. Initiative normalized. From a German perspective, this represented a doctrinal inversion. The Americans were no longer learning how to fight Germans. They were learning how to fight like Germans, but without the constraints imposed by years of attrition and resource scarcity. Rommel's preparation, therefore, was not about countering a single offensive. It was about anticipating a qualitative shift in the enemy. He advised treating Patton-led formations as mature threats regardless of their recent failures. He warned that prior assumptions, slow reaction, rigid command, delayed exploitation, were no longer reliable predictors. In Rommel's calculus, the danger was not that Patton would win a battle. It was that he would compress the Americans' transition from novice force to operationally competent army. That transition was already underway. Rommel recorded it as a warning, not a hypothesis. Rommel's assessment did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because it entered a system that could not act on it. In Berlin, the warning encountered an institutional barrier that had nothing to do with North Africa. By early 1943, the German war effort was no longer governed by operational flexibility. It was governed by allocation anxiety. Every theater competed for resources already promised elsewhere. Every request was weighed not against battlefield logic, but against political consequence. Rommel's report arrived at a moment when German attention was fixed eastward. The Eastern Front consumed men, armor, fuel, and command focus at a scale Tunisia could not rival. Reinforcing North Africa meant admitting that a secondary theater now demanded priority. That admission carried political risk. The German High Command required threats to be expressed in quantifiable terms. Divisions, tank counts, tonnage. Rommel's warning centered on cognition and tempo. He described a commander altering behavior faster than German planning cycles allowed. This was not easily translated into staff language. It did not fit existing assessment templates. As a result, the warning was diluted. Rommel requested adjustments rather than reinforcements. He urged prepositioning mobile reserves. He recommended preparing for rapid American exploitation rather than static defense. These measures required initiative from above and trust in field judgment. Neither was abundant. The Wehrmacht's institutional processes slowed response by design. Intelligence required confirmation. Confirmation required time. Time negated the very danger Rommel identified. By the time evidence accumulated in forms Berlin accepted, the opportunity to preempt adaptation had passed. Personal risk also shaped outcomes. Senior officers understood that contradicting prevailing assumptions carried career consequences. The belief that American forces lacked operational maturity had underpinned months of planning. Revising it required acknowledging error. In a system increasingly intolerant of deviation, error was not a neutral admission. Rommel's stature did not override this inertia. He was respected, but not decisive. His credibility was strongest at the front, weakest in conference rooms shaped by politics rather than maneuver. He did not control resource allocation. He could not compel redeployment. Compounding this was the absence of reserves. Even if Berlin had fully accepted Rommel's warning, the ability to act was constrained. German armored formations were either engaged elsewhere or rebuilding. Redeployment would weaken other fronts already under strain. The system prioritized equilibrium over adaptation. Rommel understood this limitation. His correspondence reflected an awareness that acknowledgement did not guarantee action. He warned anyway. That act itself was revealing. The overrule was not a single decision. It was a process. Requests were delayed. Recommendations were reframed. Emphasis shifted back to familiar metrics. American improvement was noted, but not elevated. Patton was acknowledged, but not treated as a catalyst. In effect, Rommel's warning was absorbed without consequence. This outcome was not the result of arrogance or ignorance alone. It was structural. German command culture had been shaped by years of centralized control and ideological rigidity. Flexibility, once a hallmark, had narrowed. Initiative flowed upward less readily than it once had. The irony was precise. Rommel identified Patton as dangerous because he restored initiative at every level of command. Berlin neutralized Rommel's warning because it could not replicate that same behavior institutionally. The system overruled the field without issuing a formal denial. No memorandum rejected Rommel's conclusions. No directive contradicted his assessment outright. The warning was simply outpaced by procedure. By the time the consequences became visible, the conditions Rommel sought to preempt had already solidified. The American transformation continued unchecked, not because German commanders failed to see it, but because the system they served could not respond in time. The decision not to act was never framed as a decision at all. It emerged from the machinery of command. The consequences unfolded without drama, but with consistency. After Rommel's warning was absorbed and neutralized by the machinery of German command, the battlefield began to reflect exactly what he had anticipated. American forces under George S. Patton did not achieve a sudden breakthrough. They achieved something more corrosive. They changed the direction of pressure. German units in Tunisia increasingly found themselves responding rather than initiating. American attacks were not always decisive, but they were relentless. Positions once considered secure were tested repeatedly. When resistance stiffened, Patton's formations did not disengage to regroup in the traditional sense. They shifted laterally, applied pressure elsewhere, and returned before German units could reset. This altered the operational rhythm. German defensive doctrine relied on anticipation and preparation. Fixed positions, once identified as objectives, were expected to hold long enough for reserves to be committed or counterattacks organized. Under Patton's command, American forces bypassed this logic. They forced German units to move, and movement exposed weakness. The immediate consequence was dispersion. German formations were compelled to redeploy across short distances repeatedly. Each movement consumed fuel, degraded coordination, and frayed command control. The effect was cumulative. No single engagement proved decisive. The aggregate effect did. American units, once dismissed as rigid and slow, demonstrated increasing flexibility. Combined arms coordination improved not because doctrine changed on paper, but because it was enforced under pressure. Armor advanced with infantry support. Artillery was brought forward aggressively. Logistics followed movement rather than dictating it. German after-action reports began to note an unfamiliar problem: unpredictability. American thrusts did not conform to previous patterns. They appeared before German commanders expected readiness. Counterattacks were met not by retreat, but by immediate reinforcement and renewed pressure. This forced German commanders into risk management rather than exploitation. Where once they had sought to lure American units into overextension, they now focused on avoiding encirclement themselves. The psychological shift was subtle but decisive. Initiative had changed hands. The consequences extended beyond terrain gained or lost. German supply routes, already fragile, came under constant threat. Patton's emphasis on speed meant that logistical nodes could no longer be assumed safe behind the line. Even limited penetrations forced German planners to protect rear areas, further thinning frontline strength. The effect on morale was measurable. German units reported increasing strain from continuous movement and insufficient rest. Commanders accustomed to dictating tempo now struggled to maintain coherence. The Americans were no longer learning under fire. They were adapting within it. Rommel's absence from direct command did not alter the trajectory. His earlier assessment had identified a systemic shift, not a personality-driven anomaly. That shift continued regardless of who issued German orders on the ground. By the later stages of the North African campaign, American forces had achieved what had seemed implausible weeks earlier. They had restored credibility. More importantly, they had imposed a form of warfare that compressed German decision-making time below sustainable levels. German withdrawals, when they occurred, were often orderly, but they were forced. They were reactions, not choices. Each withdrawal conceded ground, initiative, and momentum. The Axis position in Tunisia narrowed steadily, not because of overwhelming Allied superiority, but because German forces could no longer dictate engagement terms. The broader consequence was strategic. North Africa ceased to be a proving ground for German operational dominance. It became a rehearsal space for American command maturity. The lessons learned under Patton were retained, replicated, and exported. German commanders took note. Reports increasingly referenced Patton's name not as an anomaly, but as a marker. Where he commanded, resistance stiffened earlier. Contingencies were prepared sooner. Yet preparation alone could not offset tempo. By the campaign's conclusion, the outcome was no longer debatable. American forces had transitioned from liability to asset. German operational assumptions formed in 1942 no longer applied in 1943. This validated Rommel's warning precisely because it unfolded without surprise. Everything that followed traced back to the decision not to act when the shift was first identified. The battlefield did not punish Germany with catastrophe. It punished Germany with erosion. And erosion, once begun, did not stop. The post-war record removed any remaining ambiguity from Rommel's assessment. What had been observed under combat conditions was later confirmed in documents written without pressure, without urgency, and without the need to persuade superiors. German officer interrogations conducted after 1945 repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. Among Allied commanders, George S. Patton forced the most frequent and disruptive operational adjustments. He was not described as reckless. He was described as destabilizing. His advances compressed decision-making time below what German staffs were accustomed to managing. Senior German commanders, including Gerd von Rundstedt, acknowledged that Patton's presence altered planning assumptions wherever he appeared. Defensive dispositions were reinforced not because intelligence indicated imminent attack, but because Patton's history suggested that waiting for confirmation invited penetration. This was an inversion of German doctrine. Preparation replaced initiative. Post-war memoirs written by German staff officers emphasized that Patton's methods were unsettling precisely because they mirrored German operational thinking without German constraints. He exploited gaps before they could be sealed. He accepted imperfect information. He prioritized momentum over alignment. These characteristics had once defined German success. By 1944, they defined Patton's. American records corroborated the transformation Rommel had identified early. Units shattered in early 1943 demonstrated sustained operational effectiveness months later. Training circulars, after-action reviews, and revised field manuals increasingly reflected principles Patton enforced in North Africa. Decentralized execution, continuous pressure, and rapid exploitation of enemy hesitation. This was not presented as innovation. It was institutionalization. The U.S. Army did not credit Patton publicly in doctrinal language. It absorbed his practices quietly. Post-war training emphasized initiative at lower command levels, speed of movement, and integration of combined arms under fluid conditions. These were not abstract lessons. They were distilled from experience. Rommel's own post-war writings reinforced the point. He did not revise his assessment. He did not soften it. In correspondence and diaries, he returned to the same theme. The danger lay not in American numbers, but in American adaptation once the correct leadership was applied. Patton was identified as the first clear manifestation of that shift. Importantly, the record does not support the idea that Patton's impact was confined to personality. German accounts treated him as a system driver. Where he commanded, American forces behaved differently. Where he was absent, patterns reverted. This distinction mattered. The broader historical consensus aligns with Rommel's view. Patton's later campaigns in Sicily, France, and Germany demonstrated the same characteristics first observed in Tunisia. Rapid movement, aggressive exploitation, willingness to bypass resistance rather than reduce it methodically. These were not improvisations. They were consistent applications of a worldview. German commanders studying Allied operations late in the war increasingly feared not surprise attacks, but continuous motion. Patton's forces rarely allowed defenses to settle. Even when halted, they prepared to move again. This created persistent uncertainty, the most corrosive condition for any defensive system. The post-war record also clarifies what Berlin failed to appreciate in early 1943. Patton did not represent a singular threat because of charisma or aggression. He represented acceleration. He shortened the Americans' learning curve at a moment when Germany could least afford to face a mature opponent. That reality became undeniable only after the opportunity to contain it had passed. In retrospect, Rommel's warning stands out not for its boldness, but for its accuracy. It identified a structural shift before it became visible in outcomes. The documents written after the war do not reinterpret that warning. They confirm it. By the time the archives opened, the case was already closed. Rommel's judgment did not fail. It was simply outrun by the system that received it. The record is complete. A capable German field commander identified a change in the enemy not by counting divisions, but by observing behavior. He recognized that American weakness was not permanent, that it could be corrected rapidly under a commander who enforced discipline, delegated authority, and demanded speed. He named that commander early. He warned Berlin before the consequences became irreversible. The response was procedural delay. German high command did not dispute the observation. It absorbed it, filtered it, and neutralized it through caution. By the time confirmation arrived in acceptable form, the transformation was already underway. What Rommel saw as a developing threat was treated as a future problem. That distinction mattered. The result was not a single defeat. It was a shift in control. American forces under George S. Patton did not overwhelm German units through mass alone. They imposed tempo. They forced reaction. They compressed decision time. German commanders accustomed to dictating the flow of operations found themselves managing erosion instead. This was the decisive outcome. Not territory gained, but initiative lost. Rommel's warning stands because it did not rely on hindsight. It relied on recognition. He understood that wars are not decided only by resources, but by how quickly institutions adapt to reality. In early 1943, one side adapted. The other hesitated. That imbalance widened with each engagement. By the end of the war, German commanders acknowledged what Rommel had already recorded. Patton was dangerous not because he was aggressive, but because he accelerated American maturity faster than German systems could respond. The opportunity to contain that acceleration existed briefly. It passed unused. No alternative verdict remains. This case is closed. If you want more analyses that examine command decisions rather than battlefield mythology, subscribe. If you disagree, leave a comment and explain where the record fails.